Welcome, Nirali. Welcome, Peter. Welcome, Amber. Welcome, Sarah. I'm so honored to have this panel with each of you around this really important topic of healing trauma. And each of you come from such a unique background and have this overlapping position around trauma, which involves the soma, the body. So I'm really excited for us to jump in and really discuss this process of what is healing trauma in regards to yoga and somatics and embodiment. And I'm going to start with just the word embodiment, which has changed and has become more in the popular sort of vernacular in the last few years. And with that, as a word becomes more popularized, it tends to change and evolve, and the definition itself can expand and shift. And similarly, we could say the same perhaps about trauma. And so I think it's a really important place to start with each panelist talking about, what do you personally mean by the word trauma? And Amber, I would love to start with you.
Okay. Am I unmuted? Yes, I'm unmuted. So that's my do we have a time limit for a response, just so I can be mindful of that and bodyful and heartful?
You're so sweet. Let's say 3 minutes, 3 to
Okay,
4
3
minutes
minutes.
each. Yeah.
I think what I'll do is, I think there's so many ways, and trauma has changed so much over the years, but I like to refine it in two ways. One, our understanding that we really owe this to Peter, Dr. Levine, our understanding of how much trauma is an embodied or in the body. But I like to refine it in terms of exposure. And just one of the things that I do when I teach is to help people understand that what we mean by trauma is there's been an exposure, a moment of exposure, and different exposures may have different levels of gravity or seriousness. But I think in terms of the body, where we know trauma is most impactful, is that every one of us is a human indwelling in a body, or a spirit indwelling in a body. And so that exposure is a mix of how we meet that moment. Who am I in that moment? There's a real sort of personal subjectivity to that. So on any given day or any given moment or any given breath, I may be more resourced or more resilient or more able to meet it in a way where I'm responsive versus reactive. Reactive being, I'm more likely to go on and live with an imprint of that experience. From a human rights framework, because that's my work, one of the things that I think is important to note is that the exposures, they don't discriminate or they don't choose. Whether it's a disaster or something that happens. But again, in that sense of subjectivity or how we meet it, many people, and we're seeing this now in the world, are less resourced financially, in terms of materials, in terms of where they live, the structure of their house. So how they meet that moment is going to increase the likelihood that the impact, the imprint, I like to call it, is going to be a challenging one. It's a life-changing, life-altering event. Trauma, and that's one of the things I emphasize with my clients, we're forever changed because of that, meeting that exposure, whoever we were in that moment, and whatever the circumstances are going on that allow us or not to find some equilibrium to heal. I think that was about 3 minutes. I'm going to stop myself.
This is 2 minutes and 43 seconds. Well done. Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, Amber. And I really appreciate in your response that you're also framing where your perspective is coming from. And as I mentioned, everyone on this panel has a very unique perspective, a unique research process in their life, and that's fed into perhaps their perspective of trauma. So thank you for naming that. I'm going to encourage all the panelists to perhaps share that as part of their response. Thank you, Amber. Peter, I would love to turn to you and ask the same question about, what do you personally mean by the word trauma, and where does that framework?
Well, when I started to develop somatic experiencing in the late 60s and to the early 70s, I was very fortunate because I didn't know that trauma, PTSD, which was still another 12, 14 years in the future, that it was supposed to be an incurable disorder, an incurable disease of the brain, that at best could be managed by medications and by changing one's thoughts. So I had a very different perspective. And I think the summary would be that trauma is, of course, it's something that goes on in our brains and our minds, and there's no question about it. But fundamentally, it's something that also goes on in our bodies. So when we feel threatened or overwhelmed, our bodies, not just our minds, but our bodies respond in specific ways. So we may raise our shoulders in bracing against fear. We may collapse into helplessness. Again, these are all things that the body does to protect itself in the face of threat, and especially of overwhelming threat. I think Amber has summarized that very nicely as well. One of the first things that I really came to discover was that until the experience in our bodies changes, until it changes, then it continues to, the trauma continues to replay as though it's happening in the moment. It just keeps repeating, recycling, and recycling until we're able to have new experiences in our bodies. This is the important part. New experiences that contradict those of overwhelming helplessness and shutdown and bracing. So by having new experiences that really contradict the experiences of overwhelm and helplessness, we then restore not just to balance, but to a vitality, to an increase in our energy and our capacity to experience energy and to experience life. One of the nice side effects of transforming trauma, healing trauma, is it brings us to our bodies, and it also brings us to our fundamental aliveness. And by helping people find these new experiences, then they can get unstuck and move ahead in time, where before they were stuck in some time in the past, replaying itself over and over as though it were happening in the present.
Beautiful. Thank you, Peter. And I love that, that how that process can bring us back to our fundamental aliveness. I think that's so essential. And as part of this summit, what we've been looking at is, as part of even it being on Earth Day week, is coming back to our essential nature, which includes our fundamental aliveness, the felt sense and experience of that. So beautifully articulated. I want to encourage all of those who are watching to write into the Q&A box if you have questions. Also, I just want to name, if the term or the word trauma has a visceral effect for you as you're hearing it, take a moment to just move your body. So move your shoulders, move your arms, find a little movement in place. We'll take some movement breaks. It's certainly part of one of the things I've learned from Peter.
Do it gently. Let the movements be gentle.
Yeah, let the movements be gentle. Less of an aerobics class and more of a just a gentle, almost continuum
flow. Instead of an exercise, it's an awareness size.
Yeah, an awareness size. I love that. I love that. Thank you, Peter. And it's truly an honor to be here with you and what you've done for this field. So thank you. Dr. Sarah King, would you like to go next and talking about what you personally mean by the word trauma and also the framework in relationship to social justice even, and how that affects your definition?
Absolutely, Scott. Firstly, I'd love to say and express just how honored I am to be here and with all of your lovely faces. And I think that the way that Amber and Peter have defined trauma thus far has been incredibly thorough and rich. One of the things that I would really love to add from the perspective of doing work in the field of social justice, and something that I've been contemplating the complexity of lately, I had a thought occur to me the other day, whether or not being in a state of well-being and trauma are somehow diametrically opposed or exclusive of one another. And one of the reasons why I was thinking about this is because all of the work that I do is really centered around the experiences of people who have been fundamentally marginalized and oppressed. And the location of the experience of this oppression is both within the body and all of the sensations and thoughts and emotions that they have that are very particular to being an embodied being with identity. But this identity is also situated within a set of relationships that have been ongoing socially, culturally, historically, for centuries, that have set up systems in which I think that there has arisen a message that if you belong to certain groups of people with a particular identity, and that identity is that of being oppressed, and that oppression is the fact of your lived experience of trauma day in and day out, you can't get out of it because you can't get out of the body that you're in. And that might mean that some people might get the impression that entering into a state of integrating trauma and experiencing well-being is completely out of their reach, simply because of the body that they have been born into. So I would love to maybe complicate the conversation that we're having right now about trauma and ask a question: in what ways can a person live out their lives and express their identity and perhaps experience growth through the process of integrating trauma into their system, traumatic exposures, such that there's more of an ebb and a flow, and there are times when you are actually able to move in the direction of well-being as a North Star of sorts, directly within the process of integrating trauma. So they're actually potentially coexisting in very complicated ways. And that would be what I would like to offer.
Thank you for beautifully complicating that. and yeah, and I really hear you talking about the growth process that emerges as meeting what is present in that, and recognizing what has historically and socially become the catalyst, perhaps, of this change. Beautiful. Thank you. And Nirali, thank you so much for joining us. And I'd love to hear from you about what you personally mean by trauma and sort of the framework to which you view that word or that concept of trauma.
Thank you, Scott. Such an honor to be here. Wow. And I love this question because the answer to it has changed so much for me over time, my understanding. So from a tantric point of view, very much shapes my perspective, my study and practice of traditional Sri Vidya Tantra. I think of a trauma as any experience that we don't have the capacity to be fully present for. So, and capacity is a very specific word, because of course there are thousands of experiences every day that we might choose not to be fully present for. We might leave at the edge of our awareness and choose not to attend to. But the word capacity I'm thinking about if we turn towards it fully, our system would be completely overwhelmed by. And actually, in reference to Sarah, Dr. King, the possibility of even being partially overwhelmed by, not being able to be fully present to. And within this definition is the possibility that we might be able to be fully present for even the most disturbing, violent of experiences. And so it's really about developing that capacity for embodied presence. And, you know, my other context for understanding this is just my own life and my own survivorship. And I can return to something like news footage or a movie that I'd seen that previously might have been completely disturbing to me and too overwhelming to my nervous system, and watch it with ease now because of the resolution that's come through, you know, all of the somatic practice and the psychological work and the spiritual work over time. And I also really like, you know, to think about the social forces that are shaping our capacity. I heard Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez say recently, environmental racism is a pre-existing condition. Of course, she was talking about the coronavirus, but I think this is true for, you know, any pathogen that comes into our system, which can include all kinds of traumatic experience. So, of course, environmental racism, sexism, ableism, you know, any of these forces of oppression that create a pre-existing propensity for overwhelm. Yeah.
Thank you, Nirali. Thank you. I might add to that, which will include my own perspective on this, which, you know, I coming from my background specifically in stress research, and looking at a stress response as our basic biological adaptational response, the way that we are essentially in flow with stimulus. Now, that might not be the typical definitions of stress response, but this is coming from more Hans Seil's approach of that we are beings of adaptation, beings that are able to flow the waves of stimulus, the waves of the ever-changing conditions of life. And when we are thwarted, when we are challenged in that process of adaptation, we could call that in some ways a trauma, a situation in which our basic fundamental beingness of being able to be in flow with what is challenged. So that's one of the ways that I frame trauma, and it includes both in that way the sort of psychobiological spiritual process that the world is in constant flux, everything is in constant flux, and we have the means to surf it, the means to be present in it and be with it, and not be leaves blowing in the wind of life. And it is through that, and when that is challenged, I would consider that trauma. And I see someone was asking for Amber's last name. It's Amber Gray.
Yeah. It sounds to me as though what you're articulating is that learning to be skillful and flexible, specifically around impermanence, is something that is really necessary for working with trauma. Yeah,
I think, you know, when we talk about, and we'll come perhaps to the word resilience later, is that resilience is, I mean, I'm in Australia and in Byron Bay where there's lots of surfing and the wave sizes are varied. And you see these surfers being able to adapt the varying waves and the shapes and the sizes of those waves to continue the process of surfing. And I take that in is that resilience is, you know, this expanded capacity of presence to be with the ever-changing waves, and the ever-changing conditions. And when that is thwarted or challenged, we experience what I would call something present that is that challenge, that thwartedness. The nature of that thwartedness is what I would call trauma, the felt experience of that halt of our process of adaptation and being in the presence with. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, that the word embodiment has evolved, has changed, has expanded, and sometimes the definition of that changes with that. And I'm curious, maybe I'll turn it back to you, Peter, is how has the general meaning of trauma changed in the last few decades?
If you want to see how it's changed, maybe you want to go back not a few years or even decades, but hundreds, thousands years. Because if we look at the earliest recorded records, that is the same story of trauma that we see today. You know, if you go to the Odyssey of Homer, that's all about trauma. The mid 1800s, when trains didn't have very good brakes and there were a lot of accidents, and then it was called railroad spine, even though it often happened when nobody was physically injured. Then the Civil War, in the US Civil War, where we had the term soldier's heart, which really spoke about the heartbreak and the palpitations of the heart of killing brothers. And then from there, the First World War, shell shock, which really gives you the feeling of the shells exploding above these men hunkered down in their trenches. Really, I think that's one of the definitions that's most honest. It really says it's about that kind of shock. You know, of course, it's about our resilience, our capacity to bounce back, but it really is about how the nervous system and the body-mind become shocked and how we can move out of shock back into awakening and flow. So now in the last decades, I think trauma has now been, well, I think it's now, instead of something that really wasn't even talked about, it's like you can't go anywhere where it's not talked about. And it has different meanings, you know, in different situations, in different times. But really, it's the same phenomenon. And it's because we're humans, and we're human mammals, we're human primates, and we are very special mammals in some ways, and are as meaning-making mammals. But our need to connect is really our evolutionary, in a way, buffer against trauma. I mean, when they talk about social distancing, it's the wrong term. It's about physical distancing, but social connection in one form or another, and that's so important for all of us. I think about what happened in Italy when people were quarantined. So one young man went out on his balcony and started playing the guitar and singing, and then another brought out his or her accordion and was playing accordion, and then an older couple came out with pots and pans and started banging their pots, and they were staying in connection. So as mammals, we need connection. We thrive on connection. We are connecting organisms. Our nervous systems are born to participate in other people's nervous systems, in other people's bodies. And we resonate with other people through our bodily experience. So I think that's basically what I would say. It's been around for a long, long time. It will be around for a long, long time. And if people believe that trauma is something that can be erased, I doubt it. It's part of our human condition. The question is how we deal with trauma. And I know Amber's work in working in areas where there's been very little infrastructure, but natural and other disasters. And Sarah, your work with generational trauma, that things that are passed on from generation to generation to generation, that are have a lot to do with our legacy of how our great grandparents. So talking about the Civil War, I mean, people, Black people, still carry in some ways this legacy. Jewish people carry in some way this haunting of the Holocaust. And so another part that's not really looked at, and I think is now starting to be appreciated a little bit more, is how these things get passed on. Not just something that happens in ourselves, but something that has happened from our lineage and back and back and back and back. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the framework and the clarity of just how historic it is referenced and how it is changing. And as you said, you can't go anywhere without it sort of being used or named, and it's become so much part of the common vernacular. And it
expands and expands and expands.
Yeah. So with that, I want to shift to the next question. But before we do, I'd love for everyone just to take a few exhales, perhaps find that gentle, aware size movement. A little movement in the periphery, so your fingers and toes. Yeah. And as you find a little bit of movement in your fingers and toes and through your body, perhaps just notice where it is settling in you, where there is some settling. Beautiful, thank you. So I'd like to shift to my next question for the panel, which is, what is meant then? So we have this general understanding of what is trauma. What is meant by healing trauma? And I think to even get specific of like, what does that look like? How does one know when trauma is being healed or has been healed? And I think we'll go to Amber next with that question.
Interesting question, because I actually rarely use the word healing in the context of trauma. I think it's a perfectly adequate word. I think of integration, which Dr. King mentioned. I think of integration, but I also think of years ago, I started to think of it more as a restorative process, which is the term that I use. Because of the life-changing, life-altering, sometimes in ways that can be quite beneficial and transformational somewhere down the line for some people. And I think there is really a power differential in terms of access to the things that can create more healing or restorative opportunities for people. Sometimes it's not so beneficial. Sometimes life continues to be a challenge. So I think of it as a restorative process, which is a word I chose very intentionally. If our house falls down in a hurricane, we're never going to recover it. So I also don't use the word recovery. We're not going to get that house back. We can build a new house so we can restore it, but the roof might be a different material or the shutters might be a different color, whatever it is. And we've made adaptations perhaps so that the house doesn't come down the next time. So in working with refugees and asylum seekers, both here and overseas in active war zones, I really see it as a process of restoring the elements or aspects at the level of the body. It can actually be the neurological connections of developmental movements that are truncated or undermined or overwhelmed by trauma. In a practical sense, it can be the ability to go to work, to be intimate with a partner again, things like that. So we restore what we can restore. And I think of it as an integration at the end of the process. And by you know, there is no end to a process. The continuum of restoration, some of my clients will live really rich, meaningful lives. And truly, you know, clients have become speakers on the topic of trauma and healing from trauma. Some of them will get through each day and they're grateful to get through each day. Some of them will get through each day and they're not always sure that they're grateful that they're here. So we restore the aspects of a person's, the things that help restore a person's returning to their sense of belonging. Belonging, I can be cheeky. My ultimate, I call it the ultimate clinical outcome. How do we restore a sense of belonging? And that's it's a big ask in a world with so many polarities, so much injustice, and meaning making. So that's my response. I'll plant that seed and mute myself.
Thank you. It's a beautiful seed to plant, Amber. And I would say your words really resonate for me deeply, and just that felt sense of the experience of expanding and coming home as part of this, where you're referring to this process of restoration, and like recovering the parts of me that perhaps were veiled or fragmented from the experience or the remembering of that wholeness, that felt experience of wholeness. So thank you for planting that beautiful seed in your analogy of rebuilding the house. Thank you. Sarah, let's come to you with the same question. What is meant by healing trauma, if you use the word healing? And what might it look like if someone had been standing on the outside or looking on the inside? What does that look like or feel like when that process is happening?
Well, thank you for directing the question my way, Scott. And, I definitely don't want to be prescriptive in any manner, because I know in my heart that, there's probably infinite modalities and ways in which healing manifests, especially in different ways according to a person's cultural perspective, and the ways in which they employ this meaning making that Amber spoke about in the process of defining and embodying what wholeness is to them. But I did want to return back to something that Peter said that was really indicative of the power of the epigenetic perspective when looking at the process of healing. So epigenetic just meaning the combination of the ways in which everything that is happening within our environment ultimately has an impact on how it is that we grow and we develop and we move in the world down to the cellular genetic level. And some of the research that I find to be really fascinating right now in the field of genetics and looking at the impact of mindfulness. There's actually some new research literature that is looking at the healing process of African American males who have been introduced to a mindfulness practice. And they're looking at not only the experience of perceived discrimination, right? So how do I perceive myself within the world to be being treated differently in a way that is very harmful and hard for me to integrate into my being because of the way that I look in the world. But in addition, they were also looking at internalized perceived discrimination or internalized racism. And it was found that through enacting, or through rather engaging in this mind-body practice of mindfulness, not only were the participants, these African-American males, able to decrease their experience of internalized racism, right? And so this is saying something very fundamental about how mind-body practices can really shift our ability to perceive ourselves in the world as being truly resilient, and what kind of emotional buffers we're able to develop in response to the different harms that might come our way. But in addition to that, they also looked at telomere length, and they found that typically African Americans, because of the acute stress that they face due to their experiences of discrimination, they have telomere shortening at rates that are far higher than other populations. So they're aging more rapidly. And they were actually able to slow that process down. So what that says to me about mind-body practices and the role of really engaging in the power of our ability to perceive ourselves in relationship with all of the different manners that we have of being conscious of who we are in the world, in relationship, and bringing in that domain of the breath, and also bringing in the domain of intentionality, being intentionally kind and compassionate to oneself. Isn't it fascinating to think that by cultivating these intentional energies, that we can actually begin to reverse some of the incredibly harmful aspects of what arises in terms of the trauma that is always existing within the world? So I think that's a really powerful example.
Thank you. That is an incredibly powerful example. And the hope that I hear from it of as Amber, to use Amber's word, of literally restoring that within ourselves or within these individuals who got to experience that. And thank you for also naming that the answer to this question is individual in relation to a social cultural perspective. And I think that's incredibly important to identify. So thank you for naming that. Yeah. Nirali, I'm going to turn the question to you. What, if you're comfortable with the word healing, or if that resonates for you, what is meant by the process of healing trauma, and what does that look or feel like?
So I want to start just by giving this visual image that works really well for me when I think about this, which is there's a Japanese ceramic tradition. I'm probably going to mispronounce it. Please forgive me. I think I wrote it down. Kintsugi, where when the ceramics, the pot cracks, the crack is mended with gold or silver or another metal, but usually with gold. And that's how I think about trauma recovery or trauma resolution. It's not that the pot will be restored to its original form, but perhaps something even more complex and beautiful and rich can emerge. So I think my idea of healing trauma is can include like an honoring of the process. And, you know, I think that this can begin to happen when there's enough stability and resource in the system. Like I think of our human experience as an organismic experience, right? And so if we have what we need, if we think about this on, like, let's say a nutritional level, right? If we have what we need, then the body can begin to fight off illness. All the systems begin to function on a physiological level, ideally, and we can reach that state of our optimal health in that moment, given the conditions. So similarly with psychosomatic trauma that we might have experienced, part of the process of healing looks like, you know, conditions of safety for that person, to begin to restore the body-mind's capacity. And, you know, when I'm working with traumatized clients, we're never going to dig for the trauma, right? It's like my approach is very much a resource building, because what I find is that organically, when the system is ready, the trauma will begin to emerge and unwind on its own. And so when people come to me and they're saying, you know, I'm having nightmares, I'm having intrusive thoughts, I'm looking at it from a resource-based perspective, like, oh, this might mean that there's actually enough stability in your life right now, that these traumatic experiences are starting to be able to emerge, and your brain knows that there's the possibility to work through this. And so, you know, I think what that can include, I say conditions for safety, and pointing to, you know, the obvious or maybe not so obvious, like having a quiet place to sleep, having enough food to eat, having safe humans to connect with. And then I also really want to emphasize that sense of connection and belonging, and Porges' work around social engagement. I think we see this like throughout so many different traditions of, you know, the healing power of music and dance, and speaking that emotional language of connection and belonging. And then through somatic practice, you know, very specifically, I think it has to do with developing a felt sense of pleasure, and actually being able to connect with what feels good. And by pleasure, I don't necessarily mean erotic or sexual pleasure, but I mean a sense of ease, a sense of safety, a sense of flow.
Thank you, Nirali. I really appreciate that perspective, and that it feels like a very strength-based perspective, and the framework to say some of this might be emerging because you have a foundation of capacity. I really appreciate that strength-based perspective as an entry. Peter, I'd love to come to you with the question of what is meant by healing trauma.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that we're collectively demonstrating is that trauma is the proverbial elephant. One person has the tail, another person has the trunk, another person has the hip, and they're all equally true. And the biggest truth is the story that's presented. And there's a saying that says, what is truer than truth? Answer, the story. And it's one of the things that we're helping our clients do, and societies to do, is to be able to formulate new stories, different stories. Sometimes the term myth is used, and not in a negative sense at all, but mythological is one of the deepest levels at which healing does occur. These deep archetypes. One way to define trauma, one way to conceptualize the whole trauma, is that it's something that is beyond our capacity to rebound, and that doesn't unhappen. So it's something that happens but doesn't unhappen, and it's the unhappening which is where the healing occurs. So if a person was trying to escape, and they were robbed or molested or something like that by a bigger person. And for a child, of course, everybody is a bigger person. So it's something that their body had wanted to do, what was prepared to do neurobiologically, prepared to do, but didn't get to execute. And then when they're finally able to execute that movement, that's an important part of the healing. There is no one healing. I first discovered this with a client in 1969, and this was a woman who suffered all kinds of physical problems, what we would now call fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, irritable bowel, and so forth, and also severe panic attacks and agoraphobia, to the degree that she wasn't able to ever leave the house alone. And what happened there is, as I was getting hurt, I was doing some relaxation exercises, mistake, and she was starting to relax, and her heart rate started going down, and then it shot up, and then it collapsed down again. And what her body had been wanting to do, she was 24, is to escape from being held down by doctors and nurses and putting an ether mask, suffocating ether mask on her, over her face for a tonsillectomy. And her body had been wanting to run, to escape for 20 years. She was able to do that in the in that session, which was a session that really changed my whole direction and my understanding of trauma. But there's another thing I think that's really important, that trauma is not only what happened to us. It's not so much what happened to us, but rather what we hold inside in the absence of an empathic, mutually connected witness. And I think that's what all healers, quote healers, all therapists really bring, is that the knowledge of where the person has become stuck and helping them get unstuck and complete what was not able to complete at the time. But it's also in not being alone with those emotions, with those feelings, with those powerful, powerful sensations. And I think in order to offer that to others, we also, of course, have to offer it to ourselves. And in order to offer it to ourselves, we have to have it offered by another person offering it to us. So it's kind of like a go around circle. So so I think that would be the basic thing I would say. It's when something happens really where we are overwhelmed, we're by threat, and by mortal threat especially, that what is it that our bodies wanted and needed to do at that time, and what does it feel like to complete those responses? And in that completion is a tremendous amount of energy and vitality. I mean, the energy of trauma is life or death. It's life or death threat, but it's also the pure energy itself. And I think that's an important part in healing trauma, is reconnecting with that life energy, and in doing it in an appropriate way for a particular situation or population. And I know, Amber, you've done a lot of work for example, in Haiti, and worked with the drumming and the chanting that is intrinsic in that culture, because that's another thing that can be problematic when we go in and we're the ones that know what's going on and what the person needs to heal, but we don't know anything. We don't know diddly squat, and we have to find that out from the person. So voila.
Thank you, Peter. And I really appreciate, even after all of these years of your work, the humbleness of still, like, what we don't know, going in to meet another human being we don't know, even with, we don't.
Yeah, it's a mystery.
It is a mystery.
Yeah.
And I'm so in awe just to hear you just to share that as such an expert in the field, and to come back to the humbleness of, this is the process of meeting another human being, another culture of consciousness, that we are connecting with, and that we are discovering in the moment what is needed, what is needed for support and safety and connection. You're going to say something more, Peter?
No, I just muted it because the helicopters were coming over. They're making sure that nobody's walking on the beach.
I understand. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I mean, not the
Well,
beach.
Again, this is another thing that I've noticed in this and in many, many situations. particularly in this situation that we're facing right now. So things go from complacency on the one hand to hysteria on the other hand, and really not able to find a balance. And especially when people who are supposed to be giving us guidance are giving us confusing, I wouldn't even use the term guidance, confusing messages, that is profoundly, potentially traumatizing to people because you don't know what to expect. And again, it's like comes out of the blue. So I would say in this situation, listen to the people who know what they're talking about and tune the rest out.
Very good advice. Amber, I want to turn to you for a moment. This is a conversation you and I have had before about, Peter's talking about the power of a witness, a power of someone being, we might say, the co-regulator, the co-supporter in someone else's process. But when there's collective trauma, as I would say we might be in the process of experiencing now, there's a very social collective trauma where there might not be as many individuals to sort of hold the anchor, hold the ground. And I know that you have gone into countries and places in which there has been significant natural disasters and collective trauma. And I'm curious, how does one in that process find these support systems, these anchors, when there's such a collective experience of that? And before I have you answer that, I'm going to ask us all just to take a few exhales and a little bit of a little movement again. So finding a little movement in your fingers and toes, your feet. Perhaps even just letting your eyes orient to some colors or something pleasant in your space, your personal space. And again, just notice where in you might be settling as you offer yourself that in this moment. And I'll just say, as you're watching from home, you might even notice where, and watching this panel, where they're settling, where they might seem more settled in this moment. Perhaps seeing how that reflects back to you. Thank you. Amber, if you're open to
That massive question.
that massive question.
I heard two things. I heard the absence of witness, and I can try to speak to that, but also where we source support from. And I didn't know if you were referring to those of us who might go in, or those, anybody who's there. I'm refining the question so that
Yeah, I think I mean both. I mean, even, there's 5 therapists on this panel, and we're not immune to what is happening in the world right now. And that is part of the collective trauma, is that, those who sort of hold, and there are healers around the world and shamans and all of these sort of positions that maybe hold the anchor for others. Mm-hmm. And in the collective trauma experience, those people are part of that wave, part of that experience. Yeah. And so I'm curious, what happens? What do we do? That's a big question. Huge question. You have 3 minutes. I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to refer to something that Dr. Sarah King said about the integration of wellness and trauma. It could also be the integration, or, I'm going to use the metaphor of yin yang, right? Of trauma and resiliency. So much of both of those words have been really buzzwords and areas that have been looked at a lot through research. And of course, they're mirrors for one another. So I'm going to call up on what I've learned from my tradition, the Haitian tradition, I'm going to speak to the witness question, which is not exactly what you just asked, but there's a sense of being a mirror. So in some of the traditions, the medicine people I've studied with, the mirror is always present. And the mirror, so in the, whether the larger field is trauma or resiliency, there's a mirror in there. Literally, when I'm working in those contexts, I'm drawing heavily on my spiritual teachings and my spiritual practices. I always say the universe is always present to witness. The universe is always present to witness. There is some aspect of it that will still be there. And a lot of it in a more practical sense in these large scale, whether it's natural disaster or war, violence, I've worked in both those contexts. The history of where many of the traditions that people use or practice in those contexts, I really pay attention, practically researching ahead of time, listening, ears on the ground. I call it news of the world. What's going on? There tend to be some places or people where some of those practices or information or knowledge is available. I have worked, the Haiti earthquake was one where there was so much destruction. It was hard to access some of it. And then I was invited by local people to become a bridge. So this comes back to something, the mystery. Peter mentioned the mystery. Very simply, I was supposed to be there during the earthquake and I wasn't. So I was able to come in without that impact and be a bridge, because a lot of people in Haiti knew that I was very familiar with the healing practices there and that it wasn't an accident. Things like that. So, I mean, I tend to look at the mystical side of things as well as the practical. And I think I need to name, it's not always easy to find support. So working in those huge collective contexts where lots of people have been killed, including perhaps all the medicine people or many of the medicine people or the local medicine person or the local mosque has fallen down or the temple. It's hard. It's really hard. And for me, again, I always say in order to avoid collateral damage or becoming a part of the situation, this is why I screen people who want to work with me in those contexts. If you're going in to help because you think you have something to offer, you're going to be more dangerous than if you've been invited because somebody recognizes that there's something that you offer that might be helpful. We have to really be able to depend on ourselves and take care of ourselves. And it's as practical as making sure I brought enough power bars with me and stuff to sweeten my water and my own traveling altar, like practical like that, to just making sure that I know the grids, you know, who can I call every night? Who can I call? I remember in the Haiti earthquake, I had a call time with my family. I had regular check-ins with Stephen Porges, who was helping me get through some of that in terms of what I was seeing there. Just, you know, people, just the different people. Just, I don't know if that's such a huge question. Did that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a massive question. Yeah. So I think hearing your direct experience does in fact give us some response, and recognizing it is hard. It is a challenge. I mean, I know that one of the things, I think I was speaking to you, Peter, about this earlier, about in collective trauma, that I've found that group processing, that it recognize it when we go through and heal and work through something as a group, and it might be something like taking a class, a movement class, a deep somatic movement class with 600, 800, 1,000 people like we've been doing, and seeing the collective resonance of movement. And I mean that energetically, spiritually, socially, that movement, that has also that collective experience or that collective focus can also become an anchor for healing collective trauma. Yeah. With that, I'd like to turn maybe for the next 15 minutes, and then we'll open it to question and answer, or questions from the community, is how does the philosophy and the technology of somatics or yoga support the process of whether we want to say healing trauma or supporting trauma or any of that? So how does the philosophy and technology of somatics and yoga come into this process of healing or remodeling trauma or repairing? And I'm going to start with Nirali with that one.
Thank you, Scott. I can't help it. I want to speak just very momentarily to the last question that you posed, because I was sick. I've been sick, and I'm doing a lot better now. And so it just was really apparent to me as I continued to work with clients, and how the importance of, you know, the sense of interdependence and people taking care of me without me having to ask. And now that I'm recovered, you know, it really inspired me that, you know, we have to take care of each other. So, you know, I think when we're facing a collective challenge that could be traumatizing, yeah, that's the nutshell. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so body-mind practices like yoga and doing somatic work invite us back into the body. And when we've experienced a trauma, you know, part of the way our survival system works is by contracting around our internal organs, and by compartmentalizing our awareness, really to protect us, to protect ourselves. And there's such brilliance and compassion and adaptation in that. And then, so part of, you know, the journey back to embodiment is through feeling and reestablishing our present moment awareness in the body. And, you know, Peter so brilliantly talks about completing the movements, completing the actions that were frozen, that didn't, you know, get to happen in those moments. And so somatic work, embodiment work, yoga gives us a context and invites us back into the body, you know, through utilizing the breath and pranayama, utilizing the physical structures of asana to welcome us back. And then it's about, you know, the quality of presence that we have as we practice, and the way that we're able to meet our inner experience that invokes, that can allow for a reintegration of those feelings.
Thank you, Nirali. It's really clear and supportive to this very big question as well. And I wanted to go back and just recognize something that Amber said that I wanted to reiterate. And Nirali, as you were talking about it, it actually reminded me of just the power of what we might call spirit, or the power of the bigger self as sort of the holder, the witness of this particular droplet of consciousness who is processing and working towards refining that innate movement. I want to honor both what Amber had said and Nirali in that way. And Sarah, I'd love to turn this question to you around how does the philosophy and the technology of mind-body medicine, or somatics and yoga support this process of healing trauma?
Absolutely, Scott. I'd like to take a moment to just express so much appreciation and gratitude for the ways in which Nirali and Amber have articulated themselves, just so rich with wisdom and grace, and a really felt sense of their own practice. One of the things that was really coming to my mind, and it's actually, I've had a number of individuals who've come to me over time and said things like, you know, aren't mindfulness or yoga incredibly selfish practices? You know, it's just you on your mat and your cushion, and you're focusing in on yourself and how your body feels and your sensations and your thoughts and things like this. Isn't this actually feeding into some sort of like capitalistic, hyper individualized mandate that we all have this responsibility to like be our own healers and our own prophets and things like that. And it's kind of separating you out from the rest of the world who might not have access to these practices. And one of the things that I always say in response to a criticism like this is that something that I think that has gotten a little bit lost in the cultural zeitgeist around somatic and embodied practices is that ethics are so fundamental and important to these practices. Having an intentionality around how a felt sense of ethics meaning not only how I am directing compassion and responsibility for my healing process toward myself, but how am I in a very reciprocal relationship at all times with everyone who is within my community and in my environment? And how are my practices therefore feeding into these relationships in ways that are fundamentally stabilizing and supportive of safety and belonging and pleasure, as Nirali had mentioned, curiosity, all of these wonderful things. So I think that these practices, when they do become stripped away from the intentionality of ethics, there can be a little bit of, that sort of like individualized sort of reality that can emerge that I think is actually detracting from what is so deep and so rich about these practices. And then I also wanted to turn toward this concept that you're bringing up of the bigger self. And so one of my most beloved mentors is Dr. Dan Siegel, and that was part of why I brought up this word integration, because I'm just so obsessed with his framework of interpersonal neurobiology. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about both Peter Levine's work as well as interpersonal neurobiology is it really gets us into this sense of how through cultivating our somatic practices, we can actually begin to tune into how this idea of the separate alone self, like me as a single individual, I in one body that is isolated, is a lie. And so we can actually begin to look at the body as an experience as well as a metaphor. So we're really ensconced within the body of our family, and then the body of our community, and of our society, and of our nation, and then finally of the planet. And this is really tying back into everything that I'm articulating around ethics, because we can become in some ways so focused on the healing of this individual body that sometimes that might not then extend outwards into the greater spheres of the collective body that is ultimately holding us. And then we can get ourselves into situations where we can see the degradation of the climate globally and think to ourselves, well, that kind of trauma, that's not my problem. Like, what does that have to do with me? And what do my practices of healing have anything to do with healing anybody that's outside of my family unit, anybody who looks different from me, anybody who has a different sense of religiosity or cultural practices? It can actually feed into a sense of separatism if we're not careful.
I'm going to chew on that for a long time. Thank you, Sarah. That's, yeah. And so thank you for saying that. I so greatly appreciate that. And to me, that is at the heart of this philosophy, the philosophy of specifically of the yoga that we've been talking about quite a bit in this conference, that, as Nirali mentioned, the non-dual tantric philosophy, which is looking at this body and the body of the kula, or the body of the community, and the body of the planet, and the body of the universe as this ocean of consciousness. And what is happening in one part of the ocean is not in vacuum, this vacuum of another part of the ocean. And that they are, and it reflects back to all the other parts. So the individual process is significant, but it is not in isolation or in a vacuum of the rest of the ocean. That's so, I really deeply appreciate that. Peter, I'm going to turn to you to sort of with the final, with this final question before we turn it to the community.
Yeah, I'm thinking about when we responded to the Southeast Asian tsunami many years ago. At the end of every day, Daniel, who was a Qigong teacher, and we would go out to the beach. We were staying at the hotel. They gave us a hotel that we could use as our staging area. And we would go out to the beach and would do the Qigong. So next day, one of the people from the hotel that worked at the hotel said, "Can we come? Can I come?" "Oh, yeah, you can come." And so he came. And then the next, everybody from the hotel came and said, "Can our families come?" "Yeah, families come." The families were coming. Then, "Can people from the village come?" "Yeah, anybody can come. And maybe you can teach us something about your songs." And so they did. So using a practice, one we're in the field for ourselves, I think everyone really has talked about this in one way or another, is essential. And also knowing what makes sense to the people that we're working with. You know, the monks, the Buddhist monks, let us also to do sessions. We would use their monastery, and then they said, "Well, you know, the children don't know the Dharma yet, so could you work with the children?" So as a result of that, they brought so many of the children from the families, from the villages there, and we were able to work with the children. So again, finding out what is reality for the people that we're supposedly helping, and know that that's the important reality. So
again, thank you, Peter, for really framing that very humanistic perspective of meeting what's here as opposed to projecting on what we assume is here. And that it is from that deep meeting that Sarah is also talking about, Nirali and Amber, that deep meeting on all of these different planes, that this process, whether we call it healing or something else, that process of healing is possible. So Fatu, I'm going to ask you to come back and just perhaps share one or two questions that the community might have for the panel. And
Okay,
panel.
Okay, thank you so much. Lots of very great comments regarding the different explanations, and people can totally feel what the panelists just said. So one of the questions, the first questions, is regarding denial as a coping mechanism. So do you think that someone can still hold the ground for people in collective trauma while this person is in denial of his or her own trauma? And also it relates to secondary trauma for the health workers and practitioners, or every person working with people with trauma. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fatu. Does any of the panelists want to start in on with that question? You can just unmute yourself.
I think it's Pat Ogden who says you're only as good of a caregiver as you are a psychobioregulator. I don't know if that's those are exact words, but in terms of can you be in denial of your own trauma and still hold space? Yes, but only as much space as you're holding in your own system. So maybe it points back to, you know, we're all a complex organization, and we can hold space for what we can hold. And the places that are unresolved in us, we probably can't create a safe space for others to be present within. I think that was part of the question. I don't know if I completely answered the question, but I'll just let someone else come.
I might just add, thank you, Nirali. And I might just add to what Nirali said, which is we're all doing the best we can. And if you experience trauma, that's part of maybe our human experience. And that doesn't make you less of a human, less whole than we all know you are. And if your intention and your love and your desire is to hold space, do it, please. Because we all need it. We all need someone there to meet us. And yes, it's a continuous journey. I can say, the first year I was in practice many years ago, no one cried in my office. And they would have, some movements and processes, but no one cried. And it wasn't until a friend of mine asked me, well, how do you feel about crying? That I realized that my lack of space within me around my own idea of sadness did perhaps not allow that light to shine of holding space for others in the same capacity. That doesn't mean I was that I wasn't able to support people. It's just the breadth to which you can support people can grow. It's a journey. It's a journey we're all on. And we're all doing, I think, again, from what Sarah said, our values, our intention. The intention is to hold space. Then know from wherever you start, that's beautiful. And there's a process and a journey to grow.
Yeah, I absolutely love the compassion and everything that you're saying, Scott. And Nirali, I really appreciate it. I do think that sometimes there, can be a tendency within certain cultures towards like this promotion of these sort of superhuman ideals of what strength and resilience and healing look like. And not everybody has the capacity to emulate that at all times. But one thing that I wanted to bring up just as a personal example around denial, when I heard the word denial, I thought of the body's analgesic response and the manner in which when we're having this analgesic response, that is the body's intelligence at work. That's the body saying, hey, I need all the resources that I have just to get through this moment right now. And I actually can't feel all of the things at once in order for me to it's definitely built into our survival mechanism. And I think when the analgesic response can kind of begin to get in the way of us integrating our experiences is when it becomes so a part of our baseline that we don't even know that it's there. We don't know that the numbness is there. It's not something that we're conscientious of and we're like, you know what, for this moment, I'm going to kind of put this to the side until I do have the proper space and time to appropriately deal with this. And a personal example that I will have is I would say like a few weeks ago, my family and I were having a really hard time with this pandemic experience. My husband is a dentist and we had to shut our dental practice down. So our family effectively lost well over 75% of our income. And we were suddenly pitched into a place and space where we were like, will we have enough food to eat? Will we be able to afford to live where we're living? All of these different things that we had totally taken for granted, and that there was so much immense privilege in assuming that they would be there, flew out the window. And I don't think that I even noticed the amount of denial that I was in about just how badly this physically was hurting me. I was in so much physical pain inside of my body. But when I did begin to notice what I was holding was when it began to be immediately reflected in my daughter's experience. So our daughter began reflecting this numbness that we were experiencing in order to cope and get through the situation. And then when it showed up in her little nervous system, that was the moment in which I was able to take some pause and say, okay, the numbing response initially was intelligent because it allowed us to kind of get through without totally losing it. And now it's time to return back to these embodied practices and really kind of gently and compassionately feel into what do we need right now in order to feel safe, and resourced in order to orient to this new reality, get grounded, and move step by step by step forward within the present moment. Because any kind of projecting into the future of, oh my goodness, how is this pandemic going to roll out over the next few months? That took us completely back into that numbing denial response. And it was just too much. The overwhelm was too much to handle. So I just wanted to highlight that aspect of denial.
I want to say a little bit to the secondary trauma that was at the end of that question. And I'm grateful for everything that everyone has spoken. I think of denial as being on a continuum, and I won't speak to that because I think Narelli and Sarah already have. But going back to the question about humanitarian context, and one thing that I think can happen with, I'm going to call it true denial for lack of a better phrase in this moment. I mean, denial, there can be things we simply haven't discovered in our own journey that, you know, responding to wanting to be the person who goes in for an earthquake or something like that and helps and supports, that's where we may discover. And I think that's on that continuum. And there can be true denial, a constant willing repression, pushing away of what we're really dealing with. And, you know, I'll speak from personal experience. It's kind of cliche, but we do know that amongst people who do repeated deployments in humanitarian contexts, that it can be quite dangerous to them and dangerous to the people around them because of secondary trauma or secondary layers of traumatization by virtue of the constant exposure to others' suffering and then being in these very unstable, difficult environments. So just to link, Fatou mentioned secondary trauma, that I do think there is a place where true denial, not taking time between assignments or deployments, I came to recognize that in my own body. It's very humbling. It's really humbling. In Haiti in particular, I didn't want to leave and I needed to leave. And I didn't want to leave because of my relationship to Haiti. So it can be very powerful. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that experience and that wisdom. And Sarah, thank you for your vulnerability and sharing your personal experience and how that relates to this. Peter, maybe you want to talk about this or any.
I think everything that needed to be said is said. I guess I could just add one thing, that denial is not just the river that goes through the middle of Egypt, but it's a form of low-level dissociation. And dissociation is a protective response, absolutely a protective response. Now, this is different than delusion, because, and I think that's important, because when you're dealing with somebody or that is in a deluded state, you deal with that very different than as some kind of a small amount of dissociation, and that you can work with, and delusion, that can be dangerous. And I think Amber was speaking to that there, when you know, like, I have to be there, I can't leave, you know, that's bordering on delusion. Yeah. So nice to know that we're protected by the Coast Guard. Yeah, but these are times of great turbulence, and I think everyone has spoken their wisdom, our wisdom, to this subject, and just to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves and of each other, and know that, you know, we're likely, if we're fortunate enough to be at home with a partner, that we're going to, at least from time to time, want to attack our partner or believe we're being attacked by our partner and need to defend ourselves, and to allow for that also. But then to just say, okay, let's just take a walk together. Let's just sing together. Let's just move a little bit. Let's practice our tango steps. These are all things that we can do really to buoy ourselves up for these times of terror and turbulence. So I would just leave it there.
Thank you so much, Peter. We'll turn it back to all the panelists to just maybe offer a little inspiration, a quote, a little golden nugget for for the community to walk away with. I mean, as though they don't have a lot already, but I just want to add one more little golden nugget of something. Perhaps Sarah, a final thought or final nugget.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I certainly won't express any delusion around the terror and uncertainty of these times. But one of the things that has been really truly grounding to me as I take in and incorporate knowledge around the chaotic nature of what we're going through right now, I find it very helpful to tune my attention towards all of the ways in which people are becoming more tender, more vulnerable, more open to both receiving help and giving help. All of the ways in which, you know, we're in places where there are shelter at home mandates, this time of turning inward might actually be opening people up to new forms of introspection and creativity around the kind of world that we want to live in, the kind of new world that is being birthed out of this process. And I think that if we can turn our passion and our attention very deliberately to what it is that the positive transformations that we want to see come out of this, then we can approach this process with a fundamental orientation towards empowerment rather than helplessness.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. Nurali, I'd love to hear a final thought or nugget.
I think I'll share a few stanzas of one of my favorite poems here by Antonio Machado. And thank you, Sarah. That was so inspiring and very important. Okay, this is called Last Night as I Was Sleeping. Last night as I was sleeping, I dreamt marvelous error. That a spring was breaking out in my heart. I said, along which secret aqueduct, O water, are you coming to me? Water of a new life that I have never drunk. Last night as I was sleeping, I dreamt marvelous error, that I had a beehive here inside my heart, and the golden bees were making white combs and sweet honey from my old failures. Last night as I was sleeping, I dreamt marvelous error, that a fiery sun was giving light inside my heart. It was fiery because I felt warmth as from a hearth, and sun because it gave light and brought tears to my eyes.
Thank you. That was delicious. Thank you. Will you post that into the Facebook group, Nurali?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Amber, I'll turn it to you.
I'm still drinking that in.
I know, me too. One more drink.
The first thing that I thought of was a phrase that I've been teaching in an online class, be the predictability. So a metaphor for safety in terms of the nervous system is predictability. And we're living in extremely, depending upon our culture and context and how we're perceiving it, but there's a lot of unpredictability. So I've been promoting and playing with that idea. We have our bodies in whatever capacity that we do, yoga practice, meditation practice, dance practice, all the somatic and yoga practices that we all know that can promote those physiological state shifts out of whatever we're in that might be uncomfortable, perhaps towards ease and comfort, sometimes not immediately, can help us be the predictability. And it's not an antidote and it's not always easy, but that's one thing that I've been practicing. And then the last live yoga class I attended before Santa Fe went into lockdown, the teacher, she read a quote and she didn't reference it. I don't know who said it, but it was, "In crisis, we sow seeds of creativity." And ever since then, I've been seeing this spirally flower. Creativity promotes curiosity. Curiosity promotes compassion. Compassion promotes equanimity, like one of those mobiles that can spin. So that's also that openness and expansiveness of practice that we can access.
Thank you for that beautiful sharing. Peter, I'll turn it to you.
I really don't have anything to add, except this too will pass. This too shall pass.
Thank you. Just hearing that is helpful. Indeed. Thank you. And I'll just add my own, which is this community is here, this body, this kula of over 50,000 people coming to this Embodied Yoga Summit is a body that is here to be as a form of anchor and support and process and healing and ground. And I'm going to invite you to lean into the community. As you find your anchor, you become that support as others lean into the community. And as a body, as a kula, we grow stronger and resilient and can allow that resilience to allow us to be here and to be here together, and to surf these waves that is life. So I want to thank each of the panelists so much. I am forever grateful to each of you for being here and for your incredible work in the world. Please keep doing it. Please, please, please. And I hope, I have a little dream that came up while we were all talking of in like a month or two, just getting together again and for this community and other people and just connecting again. I really so deeply enjoy each of your wisdom and presence. So thank you.